In a shocking turn of events, the Late Show audience watched in stunned silence as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett tore off her microphone and stormed off set, following a heated exchange with Stephen Colbert that quickly escalated from playful banter to personal attacks, leaving the veteran host visibly shaken and the studio in disarray. The studio lights dimmed as Stephen Colbert settled into his chair, trademark smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The audience's applause died down, and the camera panned to his guest for the evening, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, poised and professional in a striking cobalt blue suit. What was meant to be a standard late-night interview promoting her new policy initiative would soon devolve into one of the most uncomfortable confrontations in recent talk show history. "Welcome back to The Late Show," Colbert said, turning to face the camera. "My next guest is a Democratic representative from Texas, who's been making waves with her bold stances on voting rights and criminal justice reform. Please welcome Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." Crockett smiled warmly, waving to the audience as she took her seat. The initial exchange was cordial enough. Pleasantries about the weather in New York, a brief mention of Crockett's recent legislative victories. But keen observers might have noticed something off in Colbert's demeanor, a certain edge to his smile, an unusual intensity in his eyes. "So, Congresswoman," Colbert began, leaning forward slightly, "you've been pushing this new Freedom to Vote Act pretty hard, haven't you? A bill that would, correct me if I'm wrong, essentially federalize election procedures across all 50 states? Crockett nodded. "Well, Stephen, what we're trying to do is ensure that every American citizen has equal access to the ballot box, regardless of whether state legislatures want it or not," Colbert interjected, his tone shifting sharply. "Some might call that a power grab, wouldn't you say?" A flicker of surprise crossed Crockett's face, but she maintained her composure. "I wouldn't characterize protecting voting rights as a power grab, Stephen. These are fundamental, enough to override state sovereignty?" Colbert's eyebrow arched. "You know, I've got to say, for someone who talks so much about democracy, you seem awfully comfortable imposing federal will on states that disagree with your particular vision." The audience, typically quick to laugh at Colbert's quips, fell uncomfortably silent. This wasn't the playful banter they were accustomed to. This was something else entirely. "Stephen," Crockett said carefully, "these measures are designed to counter voter suppression tactics that disproportionately affect communities of color. We've seen—" Yes, the old voter suppression card," Colbert interrupted, making air quotes with his fingers. "Because requiring an ID to vote is apparently the new Jim Crow. Come on, Congresswoman, don't you think that's a bit of hyperbole? Most Americans support voter ID laws." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Crockett straightened in her chair, her expression hardening. "If you'd allow me to finish a sentence, Stephen, I'd explain that voter ID laws are just one piece of a broader pattern that includes polling place closures in minority neighborhoods, purging voter rolls, and restricting early voting options that working-class Americans rely on." Colbert waved his hand dismissively. "Let's move on to your other pet project, criminal justice reform. You've been quite vocal about decriminalizing a wide range of offenses, haven't you? Including some that many Americans consider serious crimes." "That's a gross mischaracterization of my position," Crockett replied, her voice tightening. "What I've advocated for is ending the mass incarceration that has devastated Black and brown communities for decades. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, yes. I know the talking point," Colbert cut in again. "But isn't it possible that we have more people in prison because we have more criminals? Or is that too politically incorrect to suggest these days?" A tense murmur rippled through the audience. This was not the Stephen Colbert they knew, the man who had built his brand on skewering conservative talking points, not parroting them. "I'm sorry," Crockett said, her expression incredulous. "But are you seriously suggesting that Americans are inherently more criminal than people in other countries? Or are you suggesting something else?" What I'm suggesting, Congresswoman, Colbert leaned back in his chair, is that perhaps the solution to crime isn't to simply stop prosecuting it. Call me old-fashioned. That is absolutely not what criminal justice reform advocates are proposing, and you know it, Crockett replied, her voice rising slightly. We're talking about addressing systemic inequities, ending cash bail that keeps poor people in jail while the wealthy walk free, and investing in prevention and rehabilitation rather than endless punishment. And releasing violent offenders back onto the streets, Colbert added with a shrug. Don't forget that part. The audience was completely silent now, many shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The show's producers could be seen conferring urgently at the edge of the stage. "Stephen," Crockett said, struggling to maintain her composure, "I have to say I'm surprised by your approach tonight. These are complex issues that deserve serious discussion, not reductive talking points that I'd expect." From who? A conservative? A Republican? Colbert challenged, his smile now entirely gone. Because anyone who questions the Democratic Party line must be one of those, right? That's the problem with politicians like you, Congresswoman. There's no room for nuance, no tolerance for dissent. As the commercial break approached, tension hung thick in the air. The band began playing, signaling the transition, but the cameras caught Crockett's expression, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and determination. Whatever pleasant interview she had expected was clearly not what she was getting. And as the show prepared to return from break, it was evident that the Congresswoman was preparing herself for a confrontation that would soon explode beyond anyone's expectations. The red light on the camera blinked back to life. Colbert adjusted his tie, a mechanical smile plastered across his face, as if the previous segment had been nothing out of the ordinary. "We're back with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett," he announced, turning to his guest with an expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Now, Congresswoman, before the break we were discussing your rather progressive stance on criminal justice. Let's pivot to another topic that's been making headlines: border security." Crockett took a measured breath. During the break, a producer had approached her, whispering an apology and assurance that they'd steer the conversation to safer ground. Clearly, that plan had been abandoned. "Stephen, before we move on, I'd like to clarify my position on criminal justice reform, since you seem to be operating under some misconceptions." "Fair enough," Colbert replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "The floor is yours." "Thank you. The reforms I advocate for are evidence-based approaches that have worked in other countries and even in states across America. We're not talking about emptying prisons indiscriminately. Yet crime rates have surged in cities that implemented your progressive policies," Colbert interjected. "San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, all Democratic strongholds, all experimenting with exactly the kind of reforms you're pushing, all seeing spikes in theft, assault, even homicide. How do you square that circle?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't just sharp interviewing, it was becoming openly hostile. "That's a correlation without causation," Crockett countered, her lawyer's training evident in her precise response. Crime rates fluctuated nationwide during and after the pandemic, regardless of local policies. And many conservative areas with punitive approaches saw similar or worse increases. What we do know is that states that invested in mental health, services and rehabilitation had better long-term outcomes. "Mental health services," Colbert repeated with exaggerated thoughtfulness. "That's the solution to everything these days, isn't it? Someone robs a store? Must need therapy. Carjacking? Probably just needs a good counselor." A few nervous laughs escaped from the audience, but most remained silent, witnessing the escalation with growing discomfort. "That's a grotesque oversimplification," Crockett said sharply. "But yes, addressing root causes like untreated mental illness, addiction, poverty, and lack of opportunity is more effective than simply building more prisons. That's not ideology. That's data." Speaking of data, Colbert pivoted again. Let's talk about your stance on immigration. You've called for essentially open borders, haven't you? Crockett's eyes widened. Absolutely not. I have never advocated for open borders. That's a complete mischaracterization. But you oppose deportations, oppose detention facilities, oppose any meaningful barrier at the southern border, Colbert ticked off on his fingers. If it looks like open borders and sounds like open borders, what I oppose is cruel and ineffective policies, Crockett fired back, her patience visibly fraying. Family separation, indefinite detention, and a wall that costs billions but solves nothing. I support comprehensive immigration reform with streamlined legal pathways, efficient processing of asylum claims, and humane enforcement priorities. Humane enforcement priorities, Colbert echoed with a snort. Like the Biden-Harris administration's catch and release program that allowed millions to enter and disappear into the country? Crockett's expression hardened. That is a completely false characterization of, is it? The numbers don't lie, Congresswoman. Record border crossings under this administration. Communities overwhelmed. But I suppose as long as potential voters are coming in, the Democratic Party doesn't mind, right? The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Crockett sat perfectly still for a moment, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Stephen," she said finally, her voice dangerously calm, "I came on this show expecting a good-faith conversation about policy differences. Instead, you're recycling Tucker Carlson talking points and Fox News propaganda. I have to wonder why." For the first time that evening, Colbert seemed momentarily thrown off balance, but he recovered quickly, doubling down. "Because someone needs to challenge the platitudes and half-truths that politicians like you peddle," he retorted. "Your climate policies would devastate the economy. Your health care plans would bankrupt the country. Your equity initiatives would institutionalize discrimination. At some point, someone has to call it out." The studio felt charged with electricity. Even the cameramen exchanged glances, unsure of what was unfolding before them. This wasn't the Colbert who had built his reputation on sharp but generally left-leaning political satire. "And you've appointed yourself that someone?" Crockett asked. "The man who built his entire career mocking conservative talking points is now embracing them? The audience sees through this act, Stephen." Colbert's smile turned cold. "Maybe I've simply grown tired of the hypocrisy, the virtue signaling, the endless accusations of racism and sexism whenever anyone disagrees with progressive orthodoxy. Or maybe," Crockett said, leaning forward, "you're playing to a different audience these days. Your ratings have been slipping, haven't they? Falling behind Fallon and Kimmel? Is this your desperate attempt to capture the Fox News demographic?" The audience gasped. Colbert's face flushed red. The show had veered completely off the rails, transitioning from a policy debate into something intensely personal. "That's a cheap shot," Colbert snapped, his practiced television persona crumbling, "and completely irrelevant to the discussion at hand." "Is it?" Crockett pressed, sensing the shift in momentum. "Because it seems awfully convenient that your sudden ideological reversal coincides with your show's declining viewership. The Stephen Colbert who hosted the Colbert Report would be disgusted by your performance tonight." The mention of his former satirical character seemed to strike a nerve. Colbert's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his desk. "You don't know the first thing about me or my beliefs," he hissed. "I've spent decades in this industry while you've spent, what, 2 years in Congress? And already you think you have all the answers." "I don't claim to have all the answers," Crockett replied evenly. "But I do recognize insincerity when I see it. And right now, I'm looking at a man who's abandoned his principles for ratings." The tension was palpable. A production assistant signaled frantically from offstage, but Colbert ignored him, plowing ahead. "Let's talk about principles, shall we? You and your progressive colleagues love to lecture America about equality, while you send your own children to private schools. You preach about climate change while flying private jets. You rail against wealth inequality while attending $10,000 a plate fundraisers. Now who's dealing in stereotypes? Crockett shot back. My children went to public schools. I fly commercial. And I've fought for campaign finance reform since day one. But don't let facts get in the way of your tantrum. The audience was witnessing television history. A complete breakdown of the carefully crafted late-night format. Some people were recording on their phones, others sitting frozen in disbelief. The fact is, Colbert continued, his voice rising, your policies are destroying this country. Your soft-on-crime approach has made our cities unlivable. Your open borders have strained our resources to the breaking point. Your endless identity politics have divided Americans more than at any time since the Civil War. Crockett shook her head slowly, a look of disappointment replacing her anger. Do you actually believe what you're saying, Stephen? Or are you just reading from a script someone else wrote for you? What's that supposed to mean? Colbert demanded. It means I know about the meeting, Crockett said quietly. Colbert froze. What meeting? The one you had last week with network executives. The one where they told you to shake things up or risk cancellation. The one where they suggested you could capture lightning in a bottle by creating a viral moment, maybe by ambushing a progressive guest. A hush fell over the studio. Colbert's expression shifted from anger to something resembling panic. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Don't I? Crockett reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her phone. Because I have 3 sources who were in that room. One of them recorded it. Would you like me to play the audio for your audience? The color drained from Colbert's face. The band leader exchanged alarmed glances with the drummer. A producer was now openly gesturing for them to cut to commercial. You wouldn't, Colbert said, barely audible. I didn't come here planning to, Crockett replied. I came here expecting a fair conversation. But you've spent the last 20 minutes deliberately misrepresenting my positions, insulting my intelligence, and questioning my integrity. All for what? A bump in your ratings? A viral clip? She stood up, unpinned her microphone, and placed it deliberately on the desk between them. The sad thing is, Stephen, you used to stand for something. You used to speak truth to power. Now you've become exactly what you once satirized, a mouthpiece for whatever viewpoint is expedient. The audience deserves better. I deserve better. The silence was deafening as Crockett stepped away from her chair. Colbert seemed paralyzed, unable to salvage the situation or even call for a commercial break. For the record, she said, addressing the audience directly, I've never advocated for open borders. I've never supported defunding the police. I've called for reforming and better funding them. I've never supported releasing violent criminals. These are lies, and Mr. Colbert knows they're lies. She turned back to Colbert, who sat motionless behind his desk. You had a responsibility to your viewers, and you failed them tonight. With that, Crockett turned and walked off stage. The audience sat in stunned silence for a moment before a slow, building applause began to spread through the studio. It wasn't the usual enthusiastic clapping of a late-show crowd. It was something more solemn, more meaningful, a recognition of truth spoken to power. Colbert finally found his voice. We'll be right back, he muttered, straightening his notes with trembling hands as the camera pulled back and the band awkwardly began to play. But the damage was done. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation began circulating online. By morning, your Crockett-Colbert showdown was trending nationwide. Media analysts and political commentators dissected every moment of the exchange, with most concluding that Crockett had exposed not just Colbert's apparent cynical ratings ploy, but a deeper rot in political discourse, the willingness to abandon principles for attention. The following day, Colbert issued a terse apology via the show's social media accounts, claiming that he had been experimenting with a different interview approach that clearly missed the mark. The network released a statement denying any directive to ambush guests for ratings, but former staffers began coming forward with stories of increasing pressure to generate viral moments at any cost. For her part, Congresswoman Crockett never publicly released the audio she claimed to possess. When asked about it in a CNN interview 3 days later, she simply said, "The conversation speaks for itself. I'm more interested in focusing on the issues that matter to Americans than in prolonging this media circus." Ratings for The Late Show plummeted in the aftermath, while Crockett's profile rose dramatically. Her measured handling of the confrontation earned praise across the political spectrum, with even conservative commentators acknowledging her composure under pressure. 1 month later, The Late Show announced a retooling and went on hiatus. When it returned 6 weeks after that, it featured a noticeably subdued Colbert, who stuck largely to light celebrity interviews and gentle political humor. The confrontation became a case study in journalism schools and a cultural touchstone, a moment when the increasingly blurred lines between entertainment, news, and political commentary were briefly brought into sharp focus. For viewers who witnessed it live or in the countless replays that followed, it served as a reminder that, in an era of manufactured outrage and performative politics, authenticity still has the power to break through the noise.